All right. So a couple things before introductions. One, I do have a closed captioning on, so the ability, if anyone needs that, should show up on your screen, or you should have the ability to do so. It'll also allow for captioning later with the YouTube as we put it on the YouTube channel. Um, with that said, good afternoon to those on the East Coast, and of course, morning and evening to others around, in this case, the world. But I'm Michael Spencer, president of the National Barn Alliance, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the first lecture in the National Barn Alliance's, we'll call it the Summer and Fall 2026 Virtual Lecture Series. However, before I introduce our lecture, I would like to take a minute to remind folks that these lectures and events are made possible by membership dues. And while the lectures are free and open to the public, and we would encourage getting everybody you can to come on board, um, we would also greatly appreciate you considering joining the organization, and you can find more information about that at www.barnalliance.org. We also offer free memberships to nonprofit organizations and students. Lastly, if you're interested in becoming more involved with the organization, I'd be happy to talk to you further. Feel free to use the contact email on the Barn Alliance webpage that goes to my wonderful wife, Danae Peckler, who's on as well, and then she forwards it on to me as necessary. But we'll get back to you. I'd also like to remind people to mute themselves during the lecture. If you have any questions, please do feel free to ask in the comment box. I will be happy, Ken, to wait to the end, or if you'd rather, I can interrupt and we can ask as we're going along. It's kind of preference to the lecturer. Do you have a particular preference in regards to that?
I'm quite happy to answer questions as they come.
Okay. So if folks want to, you can of course unmute yourself, but also you can type it into that chat function, and I'm happy to ask for you. Um, let's see. But in the meantime, again, just make sure that you mute yourself. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome tonight's speaker all the way from Birmingham, England. We have Mr. Ken Bonham, a retired teacher. Mr. Bonham became interested in barns during a trip to Bristol when his wife Maggie encouraged a detour to see the Ashelworth Tithe Barn. On the return visit, they visited the Middle Littleton Tithe Barn, and the rest was history. Since those initial visits, Ken and Maggie have visited, I think, over 400 barns around the United Kingdom and Europe. So, extensive survey of different barn types. Recently, in 2024, Ken published two books. The first titled Great Barns of England, which examines some of the country's great threshing barns. And the second book, How to Make Model Buildings Using Your Own Photographs. And if you haven't taken a look at that or are not aware of it, it's worth checking out on Amazon. It's exceptionally cool, especially if you have kids or folks who just want to learn about it and kind of work with their fingers and their hands. Ken, that was an interesting book to check out. Um, some of you might also be aware of his 3D graphics. I know he posts a lot of those on Facebook and various sites, and it's worth checking out. I know some of those are also featured in your book, The Great Barns of England, correct, Ken?
Yes, that's right.
All right. So without further ado, again, please join me in welcoming Mr. Ken Bonham, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a great honor to be asked to do this lecture. So I shall try and find the slides and we can get started. No, that's not the right one. Sorry.
So just the remember the bottom of the Zoom should
Be
have the
with you in a
share.
sec. Right. Can you see that?
No, so you're gonna have the
Oh,
remember the Zoom window.
and I want the share.
There you
That's it.
go.
Okay.
Give it a second, and it should pop up here shortly. There you go. Perfect.
Okay, so there's the summary of my career, such as it is. Just emphasize that I am an amateur. I've visited barns, photographed them, done some research, but I am by no means a professional architect or a professional historian. So I'll hope you'll bear with me on that. Whoops, sorry. Okay, so the reason we are doing what we're doing, whether it's the Barn Alliance in the States or the various heritage organizations in Britain, we're losing our barns at a horrible rate. I've put up some extracts here. Michael has the PDF file, so if you want to see it in detail, you can do so. He'll let you have a copy. But the main thing is S.E. Rygold did a article in the Kent Archaeological Society's proceedings on some major Kentish timber barns. There's some excellent illustrations as well as good description of the barns that have been lost. This barn, I've got larger pictures of it if anybody wants them, was the Tithe Barn in Ely, and that was demolished in 1842. And then I've seen quite a few comments on Facebook from the various barn groups that I follow, where talking about barns that have been lost. And you see here, Iowa, as an example, had 200,000 barns, and there are only 35 to 40,000 left standing today. And they reckon they're losing 1,000 a year. So the work that we're doing, the work that you're doing, is very, very important. Britain is a little bit different from USA. It's minute in comparison, but it's got a very varied geology and a very varied history. And this infographic shows the different types of barns around the country and the influences that created those barns. So we have the Saxon invasions in the early Middle Ages, coming through on the south and east. We have Viking invasions on the northeast and northwest coast. And of course, later we have the Norman invasion, which brought in the French influence. The land was divided after the conquest. The land was divided between the nobility and the Catholic Church. This map shows all the fortified manors in England and Wales. That's just the fortified ones. There are also many unfortified and many castles as well. And on the right are all the priories and abbeys in England during the Middle Ages. And again, there are a lot of them. And it was said that you were only ever half a day's walk from a monastery or abbey. So these are the two sorts of settlement. Great abbeys often developed a village or a town around them, but their main wealth came from the land. And so the barn was a very important part of the abbey. And here is the great barn just outside the cloister, but inside the precinct of the abbey. And on the right, we have a very large fortified manor with a church. The church had a tithe barn and the manor had a manorial barn. There would also very often be either a watermill or a windmill or possibly both. So I'm talking only about threshing barns. Now, I know in the States, barns have multi-purpose. You have ones that hold livestock and fodder, ones that hold tobacco and all sorts of stuff. But for the moment, I'm just going to be talking about threshing barns in Britain and why they're so important. So basically, the threshing barn was a large, dry, airy building for storing and processing the harvest. Wheat, rye, and oats for bread, barley for beer, peas on the vine for making peas pottage, and root vegetables, all stored in the barn because of its size, it had a fairly constant temperature. And we know from records, both monastic and manorial records, that a prosperous English peasant in the 14th century might consume 2 to 3 pounds of bread and 2 to 3 pints of ale per day. But when they were doing things like ploughing and the harvest, this could go up considerably. So the harvester or the ploughman might get 4.5 pints of beer a day. And this was provided quite a lot of the calorific intake of the medieval peasant. The other interesting thing is that after the Norman conquest, we had two different languages in England and Ireland and Wales. The Normans spoke Norman French, and the locals or the indigenous or the Anglo-Saxon population spoke Old English. So they use words like ox, cow, pig, sheep, and goat for the animals, whereas the elite only ever saw it when it was cooked. And so they use the French words bœuf, pork, mouton. And of course, we have that day. We eat beef, but we keep cattle. We eat pork, but we keep pigs. We eat mutton, but we keep sheep. So just a little interest has, and that language in both our countries has come down from 1,000 years ago. So I see the threshing barn as the equivalent of the distribution center of the modern day. So the ploughing, harrowing, sowing, and reaping produced the sheaves of wheat which were stored in the barn. Then during the winter, the grain was threshed using flails, and you see that. We still talk about flailing about. I have seen videos of people using flails in the States, so you're probably all well aware of them. And that separated the grain from the chaff and the straw. The wheat then was taken to the mill, a windmill or a watermill, and then it was baked to produce bread, whereas the barley went to the maltings, then the brew house to produce the beer. So building these huge structures presented several problems. The first one was getting enough wood. And from the Anglo-Saxon period onwards, the woods were managed to produce different types of timber. So the standards were pruned and packed tightly together to get long, straight trunks for the main beams of a building, but they were also trimmed off at the ground level, and this is called coppicing, and that produces long, straight branches. And oak trees were pollarded at about 8 to 10 feet up to keep the new shoots out of the way of browsing deer. And that also produces very, very long, straight branches, which are useful for rafters of that type of material. The second problem was that the weight of the roof, many of which were slate, but even thatch is heavy, tended to push the walls out sideways. And they solved that problem by putting a tie beam across the bottom of the main rafters to form a triangle, which is a very stable form, or by putting buttresses on the outside of stone and brick barns. Also, they put diagonal braces from the walls through to the aisle post, if there were aisles, or through to the main post, or through to the roof to again stabilize the structure. The third problem was raking or racking, when the wind along such a large roof area tended to push it in the direction of the prevailing wind. And they countered this by putting in wind braces in the roof and diagonal braces in the walls. And you can see what happens even with the bracing. This barn here is gradually leaning to one side. We'll see some more of those in a bit. Now, the tools that were used were all hand tools. The auger for boring holes to put the pegs in, the hammer and chisel for making the joints, and the axe for felling and trimming. And these are some pictures I took of someone doing a demonstration of the preparation of a beam, starting off with marking up using a chalk string, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, and then making a right angle by using a plumb line to drop straight down there to produce the next plumb line when you turn the thing over, the beam over. Then the notching is done to remove the wood to the depth of the required, and then the trimming, getting rid of the wood to get a nice smooth line.
And Ken, you asked me to remind you it's I think we're 10:15 now.
Sorry?
You asked me to remind you at 15-minute intervals, so we're 15 minutes
Okay,
out.
thank you. I'll gallop on. Okay, so these are the different styles of barn we have in Britain. The crux frame barn with these beams supporting the roof directly from the ground. Post and truss with posts and a truss on top. The box frame where you've got this lattice of framing, which makes it very stable, but also makes it very easy to convert into a dwelling. And we're losing a lot of our barns as conversions into dwellings. Clunch or mud and stud was a very cheap form, just made with mud mixed with straw and ox blood. But as long as it's got a good roof and good footings, it can last for hundreds of years. We also talk about the shape of it as gabled with the parapets, gabled with a porch, cruciform, hipped roof, half hipped roof with a gablet, and half hipped roof with a Kent porch, which is just a roof with no sides to it. Inside, you've got a crown post, a king post, which goes right up to the apex of the roof, queen post, which has two supports to the purlin, base cruck, where you've got a cruck embedded in the wall, hammer beam, where you've got this shape supporting a vertical post to support the purlins, and a composite where you combine several of those. Oiled frames, the archaic one, had a long brace going right through from the wall, passing through the wall ties, passing through the main tie beam, passing through the collar beam, and up to the opposite rafter. Later on, we get the oiled frame with a king post, with a crown post where it's supporting a collar between the common rafters. The queen post where you've got two supports to the purlin, and the Gothic frame where you get these lovely arch braces, which were part fashion and part practical because they're very, very resistant to movement. The crux frame, as I said, goes right down to the ground, and the advantage of this is that it supports the roof and the walls are not load bearing, so you can change the walls at any time. And then we have the post and truss box frames, and these are some of my illustrations using the 3D program that Michael mentioned. So these are diagrams of those types of barns with all labeled. And as I say, you can, Michael has got this as a PDF file, which I'm sure he will share with you. These are just variations. The point about this diagram is that you can't always tell from the outside what's going to be inside. So the abbeys were very important. They had huge estates, and by the end of the Middle Ages, they actually owned about a third of England. And here's the abbey church, the cloister, the domestic buildings, and then beyond that, the abbey barn and other farm buildings. So it was all self-sufficient. This is a 19th century painting of somebody's idea of what the estate would have looked like, with lots of lay brothers and the monks working together, because then they said to work is to pray. As Michael said, this is the first barn I visited. You can see here the Great Barn. It's sometimes called a tithe barn, but strictly speaking, it's a Grange barn because the actual estate belonged to St Augustine's Abbey in Bristol, which is a long way away, but it's on the River Severn. Both the Abbey and the barn are on the edge of the River Severn, so they could use water transport to take the crop, well, to take the grain down to the Abbey for distribution there. Next to that, you've got the church, which originally would have just been a chapel for the monks and lay brothers who worked the estate. And here is the original domestic buildings, slightly altered, and now is a private house. Inside, you've got the tie beams, queen posts, and the triangular structure, making a very strong structure. On the left, you see a high entrance door, and on the left, a low exit door. And that's because they had carts with these ladders on so that they could pile the sheaves or hay or whatever as high as they could get it. And it went in through the high door here, and then they would drop the ladders down and take the empty wagon straight out. Now, I've seen a number of bank barns in the USA where the cart had to be backed in to the hayloft so it could be driven out. This obviated that problem by having an entrance and an exit door. This is the Abbey Barn at Glastonbury Abbey. On the outside are these carvings of the symbols of the four gospel makers. And this is a very high status barn. Glastonbury Abbey was one of the richest abbeys in England. And so they wanted to show off their wealth and also attract visitors called pilgrims. This is the raised crook frame inside. You can see the crooks are a continuous run from there and a curve, and they're embedded in the walls. And then there's a tie beam across here supporting huge purlins. These purlins are let into the crook, and then this is an extra crook at the top with another collar beam. And you can see here the wind braces. These are sometimes referred to as arrow slits, but obviously they're not for firing arrows out of. You'd be fairly stupid to be inside a place full of combustible straw and hay if you were being attacked. No, these are just showing off, and they're for ventilation as well. This is the Grange barn of Shaftesbury Abbey at Bradford-on-Avon. Again, the water transport was key to taking the grain to the mother church. This one has got two entrance porches, and there are two smaller porches on the rear. Inside again, you have this tremendous roof, and here you can see that the crook goes from it, it's embedded in the wall, it goes right up, and it goes right up to the apex of the roof. You can see it there. At the bottom here are horizontal timbers that stop damp from the wall soaking into the base of the crook. This is another of the barns belonging to Glastonbury Abbey. You can see these roofs are made of stone tiles, not slate, and they are very, very heavy. So you've got these buttresses at the end here. You've got buttresses at the porches, and of course the porches also help support the walls against the spread of the roof. This is the inside, again with these lovely arched braces. collar beam to the purlins and arched braces under the collar beam there. And this is one of my infographics using the diagrams that I created in the 3D modeling program. And that allows me to turn it round to take a picture of any from any angle and then label it. So there's the raised cruck, there's the raised cruck, and there's various versions of it. The medieval church, as well as the monasteries, the churches also had estates, and they built tithe barns. Tithe barns are usually next to the church, and you can just see the spire of the church poking up there. This is a Kentish barn, and the Kentish porches are only a roof. They haven't got it built out. Inside, you can see this wonderful aisled barn. These posts are about 12 inches in diameter. This is an early barn, so it's got very straight braces, although it has got the curved braces here. So it was probably added to, altered, and you can also see repairs done in the 19th century where the boot joints had started to come apart and they've had to reinforce them with handmade, hand-forged iron brackets. And this is a diagram of the barn with the pictures. So it's composite, and these again were created in the three-dimensional modeling program. This one looks like a brick barn, but the brick is a later addition, and along here you can just see the timber framing in the walls. It was built in 1506 for the Grange of Merivale Abbey. It's 44 meters long. Multiply that by 3.2 and you've got the measuring feet. We have to use both in this country. I found this barn when I was hunting through some paintings of barns on the web. And this was a painting done somewhere around the start of the 20th century. It's a lovely barn. I had to find it, so I searched using Google Maps and all the manner of other stuff, and eventually tracked it down, got permission to go and visit, and this is the view of it from more or less the same position. Not a lot has changed, except they've built some walls across here, and there is grain being stored in that bay there. At the end there, you can see the timber framing of the end of the barn, but beyond that is the brick bit that you saw, and that is a granary and a granger's room, so you can look down the barn and check that everything is okay. This is the Grange barn at Coggeshall in Essex. It was built in the 12th century, 13th century, remodeled in the 14th century, restored in 1989, and now belongs to the National Trust. Again, you can see two porches with a short wall, just giving a little bit of extra room for the cart to go in. Inside, you've got again these huge timbers. These are about 20 to 24 feet tall. 24 feet is about the maximum length of timber that you can get to make this sort of aisle post. That might be a bit longer, but it's probably done from a pollarded oak. And you can see again the braces. Whoops, sorry. This again is one of my infographics about the aisled barn. And here you can see the structure of the aisle post joints at the top. You've got a mortise and tenon joint there fitting into the mortise of the aisle arcade post, sorry. And then you've got a dovetail joint tying the tie beam to the arcade plate. Sorry, arcade plate, yes. And then it also has a, a joint for the rafter to fit into along there. Right, this is one of my 3D models of the farmyard and the domestic buildings at Place Farm in Tisbury, which was another Grange barn. The outside looks quite similar to some of the other stone barns. That's it from the outside with a thatched roof. Now that size of thatched roof weighs quite a bit. These two doors were inserted later on when farming machinery became bigger and it could no longer fit through that entrance.
Ken, I've
This
got
is the,
10:30 for you.
thank you. I'll hammer on. This is the gateway to the domestic buildings. So it was all enclosed in a wall because it was a monastic precinct. This is the inside of the barn, and although it looks as though it's a raised crook frame, in fact, it's a base crook. It comes right down to the bottom here, but it was later enclosed in stone. And this is highlighting the fact that you can change the walls without touching the roof. Right, we'll hammer through these. This is another raised crook barn. It was burnt. It was built in the 13th century, burned in the 14th century, and the roof was replaced in the 16th century. And then you see they also had to put in tie bars to hold the ends together, stop it pushing the walls over. This is one of the most beautiful barns in England. Great Grange barn at Great Coxwell. It belonged to Beaulieu Abbey, which is over 100 miles away, which shows you how widespread the lands of the various abbeys were. Again, in the 18th century, they put an extra door in the gables to allow larger machinery. You can see there's a little side door here, and there was a granger's room in above the entrance here. Inside, you've got these pillars, limestone pillars, which are about 6 feet tall. And then you've got posts, which are about 24, aisle posts that are 24 feet high. You've got the tie beams to the wall. And you've got these dull braces because it's carrying the weight of a stone roof, not a slate roof. And these bays are 20 feet by 20 feet, which is unusual. They're normally about 14.5 feet. So they inserted an extra support going from the wall up to the second purlin. There's the diagram of the main trusses with the aisle posts and the sub truss going right up there. This is Lee Court Barn belonging to Pershore Abbey, which again is some way away from the barn itself. This is the inside, and here you can see where the crook frames go right down to a low wall here. And then you've got a large brace going to the tie beam here, and then a collar beam further up. Now, this looks like a 19th or even 20th century barn. And again, it covers a crook frame, and they've just added bits of wall as the timbers in the wall needed replacing. Rather than replace them, they use stone. So here's the level of the original plinth wall. These crook blades are 2 feet in that direction and 1 foot wide. And they were made by splitting a huge oak tree down the middle using mallets and I've forgotten the word. Never mind. You'll know them. You'll know the word. This has been added to over the centuries. Started off as a 3-bay barn, had an extra bay one end, an extra bay the other end, and then outshuts that we call them. I think you call them sheds. Inside again, we've got the cruck frame, and again, these were made by splitting an oak tree down the middle. And you can see the size, get a gauge of the size by the farm machinery in the bottom here. And here's another diagram. This is a box frame barn. You can see how easy it would be to fill this in with a nice glass sheet and a little door in the middle. Put some windows in one or two of these spaces, and you've got a nice little house. And you've got these braces in the corners, making sure it doesn't rack. This is in need of attention, and it was just being prepared for sale as a possible dwelling. Here you can see the framework very clearly. This one is a post and truss. Originally it had braces like this, but they replaced them with these knee joints to give more room to larger machinery. Not entirely successful, as it's now had to be braced by these shores to stop it falling over. And then again, an infographic of the box frame and post and truss frame. Move on to the feudal manor. You had a manor house, a church, a tithe barn, 3 fields, and the crops were rotated. All the people who owned land in the village had a strip on each field, and they cultivated their strips. There was no fences, no boundaries, just tradition. And so there were probably quite a few boundary disputes. The serfs lived in houses. There would have been a workshop, a forge for the blacksmith, a well, and probably a watermill or a windmill. Whoops, sorry. Right, this is the barn at Winterbourne, Court Farm, Winterbourne. And as you can see, it's been cut off and then another barn built on it later on. This is the inside, again with the raised cruck roof. You can see very clearly how the cruck is embedded in the wall with that horizontal slab of wood to stop moisture from the wall going up into the end grain of the crux. Another of my infographics. This is one of the earliest brick barns in England. Bricks were brought over from the Low Countries, Netherlands, and then brick making started up in England in about the 14th, 15th century. It was a high status material, mainly used for Tudor mansions, but the earlier ones were also, some of the early ones are also used for barns. This was converted to stables later on, but inside you can still see it's like a barn. It's got the curved braces supporting these tie beams, and the weight is spread because bricks are not as stable as the stone. Another diagram. Right, so good old Henry VIII abolished the monasteries so he could take over their land and use it to fund his wars. And most of the abbey buildings were demolished, although 1 or 2 of the abbey barns did survive. But after that, the people who bought the land up, if they hadn't got a barn that they could use, they built their own. And these were high status buildings. And this is very high status because it's got a hammer beam roof, which you hardly ever find in a barn. It's usually reserved for high status buildings. You can see the inside here. And that's the high status building that it features hammer beams, and that's Westminster Hall in London. This is the Waxham Great Barn in Norfolk. And here you can see the tie beams as we saw in the other barn, but they appear to have been cut off here. And I'm wondering whether that was his attempt, the owner's attempt at having a hammer beam roof. And you can see here, or it may have been built like that. Very difficult, so no records. We're moving to Northern Europe now, on the continent. I've visited a few barns. This is the Great Barn at Herdoist Abbey. You can tell it's a monastic barn by the Gothic decoration on the outside. Inside, we have these huge timbers, and in France, they had the timbers that would grow a lot taller, trees that would grow a lot taller for some reason. I don't know whether it was their management or the climate. But you can see it's a really splendid barn. Again, notice the double braces here and the double braces to the arcade plate and the tie beams to the walls. In the Netherlands and Belgium, or the Low Countries, whatever you want to call, don't forget these countries didn't come into existence until much later. This style of barn includes both dwelling and animal shelter and grain threshing. Sorry. Sometimes the entrance is in a corner, sometimes on the side, sometimes on the end. Lots of variations. Lots of these barns have a resemblance to some of the structures I've seen on videos of barns in the USA. Normally, in a British barn, this plate would be jointed in here. But in this case, they're cantilevered out from there, and you've got a much lower tie beam carrying everything, tying the posts together. And here you can see the cantilever. So here's the aisle post, and then it's cantilevered out to support the purlin. And in poor areas of poor woodland, they may do with what they had. But if you think about it, it takes a really good carpenter to fit that sort of stuff together. This is another thing that you don't find very often in England, but it's more common on the continent. It's a through mortise with tapered pegs pulling it up tight. And I believe you have those in the States as well. This is the farmhouse museum in Cramsack in the Tyrol. And those are log cabins, which we don't have at all in England, but they have on the continent. And so do you in the States. So we're through to the American barns. Here's my selection of different types of English barn, British barn, and there's the variations I've found of USA barn types. So here's a hay barn in the States, a hay barn in the Netherlands, and a hay barn in Britain. Same here, hay barn in Britain, hay barn in Britain, and a hay barn in the Netherlands. And this is an interesting one because there's a winch on each post, and the roof can be raised or lowered according to how much hay there is in there. We don't get tobacco barns in Britain, but they do on the continent. And this seems to be more common than the aisled barn in the USA, where you've got two sheds on the side of a timber frame barn. Here we call them outshuts, and they're usually used as pigsties or cattle byres.
Ken, I've
So
got
here's my
10:45.
diagram again. Sorry.
10:45.
Thank you. I'll get on with it as quickly as I can. Right, so here's the English Isle barn and the nearest equivalent I could find in the USA. English bank barn, American bank barn, and you see what I mean? You drive up there, but you can't drive out the other side, whereas here it's on two levels. We don't get round barns in this country, but I think they're lovely. Someone I follow on Facebook posted this image of an Iowa round barn. This is an image of a six-sided house built in 1796 by a couple of eccentric women. I'm sure you can see the similarity. And we don't get solitary barns. I've seen lots of pictures of barns in open prairie. We don't have room. We don't have open prairies. This is an interesting one. I like this structure. The J.T. Wells design. And I thought it was very similar to these sling braces in this Alciston Great Barn and the crux in Hall Barnes Farm. You decide whether you think there's a connection. And these are my models barns. So I'm just going to exit this and show you some of my barns on full screen. Where am I? No, I've got it wrong again.
So you had it up there, so that red button on the screen sharing mode.
Yeah, sorry.
There you go.
Right. Can you switch to me now?
You're on.
Um, can make me bigger?
You're big.
Oh, am I right?
Yep, should be on
Okay.
speaker view.
So tell me if this looks okay. Can you see my barn?
Let's zoom in out a little bit here. So you maybe hold it up a little bit more.
Okay. So you can see the cruciform shape.
Little bit more, Ken. It's not zoomed out quite enough.
Sorry, which way do you want me to go? Closer or further?
Further away from the camera.
Right. How's that?
Better, and then up a little bit in front of your face. There you go.
Oh, that's better for you as well, isn't it? You
Yes.
don't see my face. Um, you see the crucifix shape, and then on each gable there is the image of one of the symbol of one of the four evangelists. And I've made this out of styrofoam and balsa wood, but then I've glued my own photographs onto it to get the texture and the images. Yeah.
Yeah.
So show up.
Yes. Looks great.
Right. So the next one I'm going to show you is the Lee Court barn. That's the big crop frame barn, biggest crop frame building in England.
It might need to zoom out a little bit here, Ken. There you
Better?
go. There you go. Perfect right there.
And I do cut away models so people can see the structure inside. Can you see that inside?
Uh, kind of. It gets a little blurry. There you go. That's a little bit better.
Okay. And then this is the barn at Great Coxwell. You see that okay?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. And I've recreated the Granger's room at the top there. And it's reached by a little wooden staircase. The staircase is gone, but there's trace of it in the wall. And you can see all the double bracing to the posts here. Yeah.
If you want to raise it up a little bit, Ken, it tends to zoom out and in. There you go. Perfect.
And I've done it, I've recreated it without the later barn doors that were cut in the end. And on the back is the smaller exit porch.
Now, Ken, the book you have about the models talks about some of the how you create these, correct?
Sorry?
The book that you wrote about the modeling talks a little bit about how to do some of this, right?
Right. Let me use one of these. Right, this is a model of the one of the a demonstration model of a oil barn. So I use my photographs or plans if I can get hold of them and elevations, and I make a jig to create the frame. I think you call them bents in the States. Yeah.
Yes.
So then I make several copies of that depending on how big the barn is. One of the things about these barns is they're modular. So if you want a bigger barn, you just add another bay. And then I cut the bracing and the purlins and the rafters. And I don't joint these because it's too small and fiddly. So I glue them. But I have done one on a larger scale. Can you see?
Yeah, it looks good.
And if you look closely, and it's difficult to get, but I've put the pegs in on this one. I don't know if you can see that. Ooh, I'm falling over.
Yeah, I don't think it likes close-ups. There you go. That's a little bit better. There, you can see the pegs.
Okay.
Yep.
And as I say, I use styrofoam. Yeah. And can you see okay?
Yes, looks good.
There's the wall. There's the wooden plates underneath it to stop the moisture going into the end grain. There's it fitted into the wall. Fitting it on. That's the cable fitted on. Okay. Did that work?
Yeah, nicely done. Get a crash course in modeling here.
But now you mentioned the book about making your own buildings from your own photographs. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
So it's basically, you know how boxes are made, they fold over and are glued together. Well, these are just boxes, aren't they? So what I do with these is I take my photographs, getting them as square onto the building as I can. Then I edit them in a photo editing program to get rid of the camera parallax, so they're actually rectangular. Then I import them into my 3D modeling program and build a virtual model. And then I turn each bit of the model into the same plane and export them as images, which I then use to make the net. And the net looks like this. Do you see?
Yep, can see the pictures.
So it's basically just a box and you fold it and glue it. Anyway, are there any questions?
Yeah, let me put it on gallery view here. Yeah, feel free to either text in the or put in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or you can just unmute yourself. And if you have any questions,
Who's taking care of all these barns now?
In England, it's the English Heritage and the National Trust. In Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, it's the National Trust. But there are also people. I've visited quite a few private barns where people have just kept them going because they love them. And I'm sure you've got a number of owners in the States like that.
Not enough. So some of them are still on active farms.
Um, we have got a few people who still have the skills to repair them properly. One of the issues is that English Heritage, particularly, are very particular about the use of correct materials and correct methods. And so a number of places farms I've visited, when I've knocked on the door and said, please, could I have a look at your barn? Um, the response has been, "You're not with English Heritage, are you?" uh, because they're afraid that I'm going to slap a preservation order on it. But after I persuaded him that I'm just a harmless amateur, most I've only been refused entry to the barn 3 times of the 400 barns that I've visited. So that tells you the pride that most people take in them. Unfortunately, a lot of farmers are pushed to convert them to wedding venues or conference centres just as an extra income stream because they're so very expensive to maintain. I mean, repairing or restoring a medieval barn, fairly, normal sized medieval barn, could cost from £500,000 upwards.
Wow. And you have a timber framers guild type group there too, right?
There's a carpenters fellowship. I don't think there's a timber framers guild as such. There may be. Um, a lot of what I've done has been um, happenstance. I've happened to come across them, or I've happened to be able to get into one. So, um, and not being a professional myself, I haven't tried to join any of those groups. Although the Carpenters Fellowship did invite me to give them a talk a few years ago. That's
and
that's if you're interested, that's on YouTube.
Matt Hunter was kind enough to post a link to the Carpenters Fellowship in the chat box, so you can check that out.
Ken, I just want to say thank you again for taking time to give this lecture at what is normal bedtime. But I will just say how much I think once I started seeing what you were sharing on Facebook with all of this modeling, it brought up to mind how important good documentation is to
Absolutely.
resources that are threatened. So, they wouldn't have been able to rebuild Notre Dame if they hadn't had, such great modeling to detail what I know a lot of timber framers in America, just absolutely adored all of the elements and the quirks, that they were able to recreate. So I appreciate, and I did have to buy. Hope you didn't buy one, Michael, because I just bought a copy of the book already, because I know that it's something that I would love to catch on and have more people, contribute to. I also just want to take a minute to say, Charles, I think I see you on here, and I hope that you are happy. And Charles used to be the president of the National Barn Alliance and was very instrumental in helping us get barn models. And these were actually timber frame models that we would take for children to be able to practice putting together as a team building exercise. So definitely a bit bigger than what your scale is doing, but I think still the power of models and being able to physically convey that has real resonance. So thanks again for all of your time, and I really look forward to learning more.
You're very welcome. Just one very quick one. If your timber frame people are interested in that sort of thing, there's a place called Guédelon in France where they're building a 14th century castle from scratch.
Wow.
Right? Just search it. Guedelon, Guédelon.
Awesome.
And I have done a post about it as well if you'd search for that.
Okay.
Well, if there are no other questions, I'll go ahead and stop the recording here.